Welcome to Switzerland and Sound. This is Bob Zanotti. This is a very special moment.
Gordon. Latu. Murata. Nikto.
This is a special program for us today, a speaker that we've long wanted to have as part of our monitoring group speaker series, and we have him today on our screen with Bob Zanotti, HB9ASQ. He's an old friend. If he doesn't sound Swiss, he sounds like he's from New Jersey because he's our local. He grew up in the next town over from where the club is. So let me turn the program over to introduce Bob to Dave Marthouse, N2AAM, who really was the impetus, the catalyst for getting Bob on the program today. So Dave, let me turn it over to you, N2AAM.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, and welcome to the FairlawnARC Kawfee Talk this Saturday morning. And I'll give you a little background first. I got to take you back on a time warp back to 1970. I was 14 years old. It was way before I got my ham ticket in 1978. I was just getting into shortwave listening and listened to stations like the BBC, Radio Netherlands, and a certain station in Switzerland, well, the SBC. It was before they were known as SRI, but they were known as SBC. And there was a show on the air called The Two Bobs. I had all sorts of technical questions as I was learning about radio and, had a lot of rudimentary questions. And I drag out my old Underwood Olivetti typewriter. Yes, this was the days before email. And I wrote out a letter to SBC 3000, Bern 16, Switzerland, with a couple questions, not realizing that I figured probably they got so many letters that I probably would not get answered on the air, but I had a couple tech questions. I sent them in, and a couple weeks later, I was sitting there Saturday night at about 9 o'clock local time in my bedroom, listening to my shortwave receiver, listening to Swiss radio and listening to the Two Bobs do their thing. And all of a sudden I heard them say, "We have a letter from David Marthouse in Clifton, New Jersey." And I just about jumped off the bed and run into the kitchen. And my mother was sitting there, and I go, Mom, they're reading my letter from Switzerland. They're reading my letter from Switzerland. And now let's spin the time warp. 50 years later, things have gone full circle. I got into broadcasting commercially as Bob got into the shortwave side of broadcasting, and one thing led to another, amateur radio, etc. 50 years later, I am now introducing Bob Zanotti, HB9ASQ, to the FairlawnARC audience as a result of both had parallel careers in broadcasting in a way, me being in commercial AM radio and Bob on the shortwave side of the house. We met on ham radio, on email, etc., and have been talking for several years. And as a result, we've gotten to be good friends. And Bob, I'd like to thank you. You have brought me full circle time-wise back to 50 years ago as a kid when I first heard the Two Bobs. So without further ado, let's switch it over to Bern in Switzerland, HB9ASQ. Bob Zanotti, welcome to the program.
Well, N2 AAM, November 2, always AM. This is HB9ASQ, near Bern, Switzerland, returning. Dave, thank you very much for that. And that's a great story. I almost remember that letter, and I'm not putting you on. I almost do. We had so many people who used to write to us, but we were very careful. Bob was very careful. We'll get into the story of the Two Bobs and how Bob Thomann and I got together a little later on. But thanks very much for that really nice introduction. And thank you, the Fairlawn Amateur Radio Club, for inviting me on. It's a great honor. And as Ed said before, I'm a local guy. Born in Patterson, raised in Hawthorne and Franklin Lakes. I went to school with Debbie Harry of Blondie, by the way. She turned a lot of heads back there in Hawthorne High School even then. Even more at the Hawthorne Public Swimming Pool. But that's another story for another time. Anyway, yeah, I feel like I'm coming home. I really do. And I must confess I should get on the local repeater more than I have done. And Dave and I, N2AAM, have quite a few contacts through SWLing, through his link at home. But I'd like to get on the repeater and talk to the other guys around there. But I'm really thrilled and honored to be invited to be able to talk to you today. I have about 100 things I'd like to talk to you about, but I've had to reduce that to a lesser number because for the sake of time. Let me just briefly let you know how I got involved in ham radio and shortwave listening. We heard Dave's story there. Actually, I've got my grandfather. How many of us thank our grandfathers for getting us into shortwave radio? I'm one of them. My grandfather lived up the street from us on Mawiney Avenue in Hawthorne. And he, in the 1930s and 40s, he used to be a fireman on the Susquehanna Railroad. And the terminal was down there. I think it was River Edge or somewhere down there pretty close to Lower Manhattan. Radio Row, in the grand old days of radio. Radio Row, that's where you went to buy radio equipment. He used to go over when he was firing. He'd go down there to the terminal after a day's work, and he'd take the ferry for 5 cents and go over to Cortlandt Street and all those places down there at Radio Row. Sometimes he'd bring home equipment, a new antenna, some wire, junk. You know, my grandmother used to think he was crazy. He'd come home with radios. Well, he was the one who introduced me to shortwave radio, to HF. He was never a ham, but in the 30s and 40s, he was an avid shortwave listener. And up at 45 Mawiney Avenue, up the street from us, he had a big, old Crosley. One of those big wooden cabinet Crosleys. They were about 3.5, 4 feet tall. And that was his radio. And in the back of the house, he had a telephone pole. I don't know how he got it up there, but he had a telephone pole, and he had a solid copper wire, maybe about a number 12 wire, going to the house. And then he would sit there and listen on his Crosley. And he was telling me, he would tell me stories about how you could hear the world. Oh, you can tune around the world. You can hear Berlin. You can hear Rome. You can hear all over the place. And of course, me as a silly kid, I figured that you could hear local radio stations on AM or medium wave anywhere in the world. But I learned later that it didn't work that way. Anyway, he said, here's the radio. And I tuned around, and I was all excited, waiting to hear the world coming in. And all I heard was WABC, 770 AM medium wave with 50 kilowatts line of sight from the house. And I got a little bit disappointed, waiting for the world to come in, and all I could hear was WABC. But the sound of that Crosley was absolutely fantastic. When that thing, when that boomed, it had about a 10-foot wide bass speaker, and when that thing shook, the whole house shook, But I was a little bit disappointed, and I sort of lost interest a little bit, and told my grandfather, I don't hear much on that. Anyway, to cut to the chase, a couple of years or so later, I was maybe 13, 14, maybe 10, 11 years old. I came down from my room upstairs on Christmas morning. And there under the Christmas tree, there it was. This carton box. It wasn't wrapped, but it had the word Hullecrafters on it. It was a Hullecrafters S38E. Not the D. It was the new one. The S38E. My God. I had my food set upstairs. I never came down again the whole Christmas period. There was a 75-foot piece of wire that I threw up to the garage, got out there in the middle of winter, and there it was, the world. I was hearing all of this exotic music from Egypt and Russia. Govorit Moskva. This is Radio Moscow. And I mean, this was it. This is what did it. I was hooked on shortwave. And that's how it started. And a couple of years later, I mean, with my old S30AD, I was listening to the radio hams, especially on 40 and 80 meters. And I learned, how to do it. I learned from the old timers, procedures and what they were talking about. And I learned a lot of technology. And some local guys in Hawthorne helped me out. And I went for my novice. That was 1961. And I got my novice ticket. I had to do 5 words per minute code test. But I got Whiskey Victor 2, Uniform Papa, Quebec, WV2UPQ. And I had that for a year, and then the next year I moved up to a technician, became WA2UPQ. That's the way it worked in those days, You started off as a novice with a V, and then it went to an A. And then finally, a couple of years later, I got the general. And that's how I got into to ham radio and shortwave. And then jumping a little further ahead, in high school, I was about 18 in Hawthorne High School. And I just had this urge to be a broadcaster. Maybe it was reincarnation. I don't know what. Maybe I was a broadcaster in a previous life. I don't know. But I just fell in love with broadcasting, radio. And through a ham, and I can't remember his name anymore or his call, Madison Avenue, Lower Patterson, Madison Avenue, Lower Madison Avenue, across the river from Hawthorne. He somehow had a contact with WFMU, the FM radio station of Uppsala College in East Orange. And he said, they're looking for people to do radio programs. And I said, really? He said, yeah, come on down with it. But anyway, I went there and I wanted to do a radio show. And I was a big fan of Long John Nebel. Anybody remember Long John Nebel? From midnight to 5 o'clock in the morning. Hello, friends and neighbors. This is Long John once again. We're with you 7 days a week from 5 o'clock, 12 o'clock midnight to 5 in the morning and 5:30 on the weekends. Tonight we're talking about flying saucers. We have Anderson. We have, Jim Mosley. We have Dominic Luce. Anyway, and I thought that was a great program. And I was always interested in flying saucers. And all kinds of occult stuff, ghosts, and spiritualism. And I went down to WFMU, and I said, I'd like to do a radio show. You're looking for somebody? He says, yeah, what do you want to do? I said, well, I told him about my idea. Yeah, okay, you can start next Friday night. And it was 9 o'clock in the evening, went to 10:30, and that show went on for several years on a Friday night. It was just like the Long John show. And in the meantime, I started my studies of broadcast journalism at New York Institute of Technology in Manhattan. And I held down the show in the meantime. I had a chance in 1964 to spend a couple of years in Stockholm at Radio Sweden in Stockholm. I worked freelance for the English service. I was there for about 2 years. Met my Swiss wife-to-be, not Swedish, but Swiss wife-to-be. And we've been married for 52 years and have 4 daughters and 7 grandchildren, the youngest one 5 months old. So we've been together a long time. I worked with Arnis Skog. I don't know if anybody remembers Arnis Skog. He was a ham and Mr. DX, Mr. SWL in Sweden. And I voiced on the Tuesday program called Sweden Calling Dxers. That was a very, very popular program. And then after a couple of years, my wife-to-be and I had sort of had enough of Sweden. She wanted to go back to Bern, so we went down to Bern. I was here for a year or so. And then to really make a very complicated story short, which is very difficult for me at the best of times, I come from an old raconteur tradition. We went to New York. We went back home in Franklin Lakes. And I wanted to continue my studies at New York Tech. My wife-to-be wasn't too happy there. She didn't speak English too well, and she was Swiss. And I said, well, why don't we go to Montreal? Montreal has a great communications program. Loyola College, Concordia University, I can go up there. And she said, okay. So we went up there, and we lived for 2 years. finished my studies at Loyola, and worked for CKGM, the big talk station in Montreal, on weekends. So I was studying and holding down a job at the meantime. Well, after that, I longed for Europe because I toured Europe in 1964 for about 10 weeks. And I just fell in love with it. I always wanted to be either an international broadcaster or part of the diplomatic service. I liked languages. I liked other cultures. I traveled. I loved to travel. So anyway, I knew about Swiss Radio International. At the time, as Dave pointed out before, it was called SBC, the European and Overseas Services of the Swiss Broadcasting Corporation. And I wrote a letter to the director. I don't know. I believe in synchronicity. I don't believe in coincidence. There's some guidance in there somehow. And I wrote a letter saying, I did this and I did that, my CV, and I had various languages that they needed because Switzerland is a multilingual country. And I worked for Radio Sweden, and they wrote back saying, you have all the credentials we're looking for. We're changing our format from recorded programs to 30-minute live programs, heavy accent on news and current affairs. Our new head of service will be Mike McMahon, a Canadian, and we've passed the letter off to him. And he wrote back and said, you've got the job. It's like that. As a side anecdote, at the time, there was a postal strike in Canada. I waited and waited for a reply and didn't get it. I finally invested very heavily. I had to see my banker for a loan to make a phone call transatlantic to Switzerland to call SBC, Swiss Broadcasting Corporation. And I got through, and I got through to Mike McMahon. He said, yeah, what happened? We sent you a contract. I said, I never got it. We got a postal strike here. Anyway, we sorted that out. And on the 1st of April, no April Fool's joke, on the 1st of April, 1970, I started with the English service of Swiss Radio International, and I stayed with them until February 2002. My main job there was as a journalist, reporter, presenting Dateline. Welcome to Dateline. This is Bob Zanotti in Bern, Switzerland. In today's program, I could do it in my sleep, and producing features. I interviewed, oh my God, I've lost track. Everybody from Prince Philip to Tina Turner and everything in between, Nobel Prize winners, Secretaries General of the United Nations. It was part of my daily job, and I loved it. I felt as though I was stealing the money. Very few of us, and I was one of the fortunate people who could say that his job was like a hobby. It really was. I couldn't wait to go to work in the morning, and I was the last one to go home in the evening. I just loved it. And it was just me. The Hindus would call it dharma, the thing that you're meant to do in life. It was my calling. And I loved it. And those were golden years. And then 1970, to go back to the beginning of the two Bobs, or as it was called at the time, and still officially in the books, the Swiss Shortwave Merry-Go-Round. I remember going into work one morning. It was very, very shortly after I started work there. And Bob Thomann, HB9 Golf X-Ray, HB9GX, silent key, unfortunately. He left us about 3 years ago. A great personal friend, not only a colleague, but a great friend. I'll get to that in a moment. That was the secret of the two Bobs. We just got along beautifully together in real life and not just on the microphone. But anyway, they called me in, and I don't know how they found out, but it didn't take them long to find out that I was a radio ham. They said, oh, our co-presenter for the Swiss Shortwave Merry-Go-Round is leaving to go back to England. How would you like to take over the show with Bob Thomann? I said, sure, why not? Sounds great. Nothing against it. And we were introduced, and it just gelled. It just hit perfectly from the very first instant we met. We were instant friends. And that's how the two Bobs got together. And we were together for 24 years doing that show. And it was non-scripted. We didn't need a script. We just sat down when just a few minutes before recording time, Bob would show up and I would show up. And, hi, Bob, how are you? We get into the studio. So what have you got? They got these letters and that letters, you know, like Dave Marthouse was saying. And Dave's letter was among them, like so many others. And Bob made a couple of notes, and we just sat down and started to talk. That was it. That was the magic of the two Bobs. We just were perfect partners. And I remember one of the greatest compliments we ever got was from a producer, the producer of the BBC Wave Guide, if anybody remembers the Wave Guide on BBC World Service. I met him at a meeting in London one time, and he said, Bob, I have to tell you something. I've got to pay you a compliment. You and Bob Thomann are absolutely not to be duplicated. We tried it on Wave Guide, bringing in two voices and spontaneity. You can't do it. You are absolutely inimitable. And that was the magic formula of the two Bobs. And I must say, losing Bob was a great loss. And he'll come up again a little later on when I talk about the Italian radio relay service coming up soon. Right now, as a matter of fact. I have to go back to maybe about 1986, 87. Everything was going beautifully at Swiss Radio International. I was doing the programs in my sleep. I enjoyed my work, as I said before, but it became a little bit too much of a routine. And at that time, the SWLs will remember, the DXers will remember, this was the golden age of private, unlicensed radio in Italy. You could do anything. The Italian Constitutional Court ruled that any Italian citizen had the right to run a radio station. No license, wasn't necessary. It was part of the law on freedom of speech. And it worked for a while anyway. And I had that in the back of my head. And it was, I don't know, springtime, about 86, 87. I had this idea. There was too much of a routine at SRI. And I said, wouldn't it be fun to start a radio station, a shortwave radio station? And by coincidence, and there are none, I don't believe in coincidences, the head of our transcription service, Andreas Luti, came by one time and he said, oh, we had an interesting visitor here today, Alfredo Cotroneo from Milan. He runs an English-speaking FM radio station in Milan, carrying the BBC and English language programs. And he asked for transcription material. I said, oh, give me his contact information. And Andreas did. And I called up Alfredo and I said, Alfredo, I've got an idea. What would you think of starting a shortwave broadcast station from Milan? Well, we took a drive down. It's only, it's a couple of hours from here to Milan. And he received us graciously. I presented the idea. He loved it. And that was the beginning of the Italian radio relay service, IRRS. And it was like a super ham station. I did the engineering for it. We sold time. It was the classic time sale station. And enter Bob Thomann in just a moment. I remember going with Alfredo, driving down and going all over the place. He put an ad in the paper looking for locations to put the station. And the last location on the list was a place at Robeco su Novillo. Heavy, high water table right next to a river, the Novillo. And I saw the pictures. We went there at the end of the day. I said to him, this is the promised land. This is where we shall build our station. Borrowing from the religious term, this is where we shall build our church. I wasn't St. Peter, but St. Bob. And I said, this is where we're going to put it. And it was the dream of a station, flat as a pool table. And I did the engineering. We had multi-band dipoles, and we got out of there like a bombshell. And enter Bob Thomann. We found out that the Swiss, at the time, Post Telephone and Telegraph Administration, was selling off some very old 20 kilowatt transmitters they use for radio telephone services. And we went to see them. Alfredo came up and we went to Schwarzenburg to see them. And we just said, no, we can't use these. And we went home disappointed. I mentioned to Bob Thomann that we saw the old transmitters at Schwarzenburg, which was our main transmitter plant. We had about, I think they had 6 250 kWs. They had one 300 kW transmitter there. Most of them were Brown Bovaris, and the 300 kW was Marconi. And they were using a collinear curtain array there and log periodics. And I told Bob, I said, we're looking for transmitter. He says, well, I just happen to know. And Bob, by the way, had a day job. He was the supervisor at Hotel Echo Bravo, Switzerland's aeronautical HF communication station, which no longer exists. And he said, well, I hear tell that the two 10 kilowatt Siemens transmitters that we're using at Schwarzenburg are going to be scrapped, and they're going to move new transmitters to Prangin near Geneva. I said, oh? He said, yeah, call Danny Weber, the chief engineer of Schwarzenburg. And I did. He said, how did you find out about that? I said, well, I have friends in high places, Bob Thomann. He said, oh, and Danny was a ham as well. So anyway, to try to make a long story short, which I repeat is very difficult for me at the best of times, we had 2 of them we could have. We bought one for the proverbial steal. It cost a king's ransom. They were $150,000. We got it for $13,000. And Alfredo and I pitched in 50-50, and we bought one. Later on, we bought a second one as a standby. Now, these transmitters they were jewels. They were like a Rolex of HF communication equipment. They were all mode, all bands. Complete automatic switching could be automated and computerized. They would switch. They were from 1.6 megahertz, 1600 kilohertz, to 29999 megahertz or kilohertz, and could switch automatically in less than 8 seconds. This is exactly what we needed. So we bought them, installed it. I remember, oh my God, the weekend, we got up the antenna. I designed a multi-band dipole. At the time, we had 80 meters, 40 meters, 41 meters, and 31 meters. And the first night of, we spent 2 days there putting up everything. And everything worked. Everything worked. It was beautiful. And what we did something very smart, thanks to Bob Thomann. It was his idea. Bob Thomann was a big SSB man. He believed in SSB broadcasting from the beginning. It was a hobby horse of his. So he said, listen, that transmitter will do 10 kW PEP, but it'll do A3, double sideband modulation, but it will also, with a small modification, it'll do A3A, reduced carrier single sideband. He said, that's the way to go. And so that's what we did. We modified the transmitter. So what we had an AM compatible signal with the power of single sideband. We had a carrier, I think, about 2.5 kW, and we modulated up to 5 kW, and I tell you, that thing got all over the world. We had reports from Asia, Africa. I heard it myself in South Africa. I heard it in Phoenix, Arizona. It just worked beautifully. Our clients at the time were United Nations Radio, and of course we had the preachers, the religious broadcasters. It was a super ham station. We made a little bit of money, but not much. I was able to get enough money the first year to buy a new used car, if that isn't an oxymoron. And but otherwise, it was just a labor of love, un travail d'amour, just a labor of love. And the station is still on the air. IRRS is on the air, but we dismantled the HF transmitter in Milan in 2004 or 2003. It's still on the air, but it's broadcasting through Bulgaria and Romania. And I have no contact with Alfredo Cotroneo anymore. We had a disagreement about something, and that belongs to the past. But it was a great time. I used to, oh my God, I spent most of my time every other weekend and sometimes every weekend on the road between Bern and Milan to operate the station manually until we finally went automation with it. And it worked beautifully. I remember one very, very great anecdote. The time we did battle with the BBC with the BBC World Service on 3985. This was in the early 90s. We were duly registered. We were very careful, even though we didn't need a license. We registered our frequencies. We went to HFCC, the High Frequency Coordinating Committee, and we were recognized and licensed by the Italian authority. But the BBC didn't like it. We took over 3985 when Swiss Radio International left it. And it was a great frequency we had. The BBC just plopped itself 250 kW, I think, from Wolferton, right on top of us. And we were fighting them. They thought they would dominate the frequency. So we did a very clever thing. I think it's clever, and it worked. What we did, they were running 250 kW, double sideband AM. So I said to Alfredo, let's give them a run for their money. When they go on the air, we will run 10 kW, highly audio processed modulation using an Orban Optima 9105A, which I have, by the way, in my shack here. Now, that's my audio processor. And we'll give them a run for their money. We had reports from all over Europe from monitors. The BBC was rendered inaudible. You could not hear a thing. We were 10 kW USB. That's a lot of power if you're using single sideband only. The result was in 2 weeks, the BBC left the frequency. So that was a great little triumph for us. We're a shortwave today. I'm afraid not in a good place. I remember back at SRI, we had a guy who should not have been in the job. He was given too much responsibility with no credentials, no background in broadcasting. And he went to a BBC meeting once, came back saying, the BBC says shortwave is dead. Shortwave is dead. And everybody believed it. Swiss Radio International, to my knowledge, was the first shortwave broadcast station to leave the air in 2004. The other, the group of four, the group of six, they were called, Radio Netherlands, Radio Sweden, Radio Canada International, they all told him it's premature, it's too soon, but no. In typical Swiss style, they wanted to save money, but in all fairness, it wasn't only about money. Our main transmitter plant at Schwarzenburg was under fire from ecologists. People were complaining. for environmental reasons, so they shut the station. We were buying time abroad from the Deutsche Welle, from Radio Netherlands, Bonaire, and China. We had arrangement with China Radio International, a frequency swap. But it was decided that shortwave was too expensive. The way to go was the internet. Then in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, and everybody was jubilant. This is the end of the Cold War. Reminds me of Neville Chamberlain waving a piece of paper as he comes off the plane after Munich. I bear good news. Peace in our time. There will be no war. Herr Hitler has assured me of this. A week later, Hitler marched into Poland. Well, the same sort of thing happened with shortwave radio. A lot of people who were paid to think were not doing their job. They were euphoric. Oh, the Cold War is ending. We can save a lot of money. The internet was coming up. But in the meantime, there were other ideas like rebroadcasting on local radio stations, satellite. I used to do a morning show from 9 to 11 on Astra, our satellite over here called Mid-Morning. Everybody was enthusiastic. It was a good show, but nobody heard it. I might as well have been broadcasting into a dummy load. It's just nobody there. And so they finally took it off the air. And then the internet came along, and I was invited by the director of SRI at the time, Carlo Ferrari, to be a member of the committee to take SRI from shortwave to internet. That was the answer to everything. It would cost us nothing. We could continue with our broadcasts on the internet, but we wouldn't pay a lot of money for shortwave, and on and on and on. Well, the promise of audio from Swiss Radio International on the internet never came to fruition. We all know that. Now it's become Swiss Info, which in my opinion is just a dry text news service. They never go anywhere. I remember in the heyday of SRI, we were on the road constantly. We even beat national news, television, and radio to stories. We ran ourselves like a commercial radio station. We were there. We met the people. We talked to the people. We knew the people. We spoke the languages. And we got the story. And all they're doing at Swiss Info at the moment, they're all sitting in a beautiful palace on Giacomettistrasse in Bern, spending a lot of money. They got coffee machines everywhere. It's a palace. They never leave the place. They don't go anywhere. They don't know really anything about Switzerland. All they do is sit there and translate news stories that other people have written. We used to write the stories. We did the interviews. We were there on the spot. But this is gone. There's nothing left of SRI. And Swiss Info, I'm sorry, is just a joke. And, around 2000, when SRI shortwave was coming to an end, it was already buzzing and talking about it, 2001 or so. The last days, there was a complete shakeup. There was a total reorganization, restructuring at SRI. And I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but I think it's very important if we're documenting what happened to SRI. They appoint the classic case of the wrong guy in the wrong job. SRI used to be run by people who knew broadcasting. They were broadcasters. They were professionals. But then the corporation brought in people who would make Swiss Radio International their last parking place in the corporation. Technocrats who knew nothing about broadcasting. They even hired Arthur Anderson. And what happened to them? A year later, they went bankrupt. Completely disreputed as being totally incompetent. They deemed that shortwave radio was dead. Nobody wanted it anymore. These guys They were doing research projects into sausages a week before. Now they were doing a deep, profound research into shortwave. And what happened? Shortwave was dead. They brought the wrong people in. They did something which in radio is never done in broadcasting. They made the head of the newsroom the head of a combined English service and newsroom. That's oil and water. They do not mix, never have, never will. The upshot of it is mobbing, as they call it over here, bullying, trying to force people out of their jobs, demoralizing them. I was one of the victims. Dick Dawson, if you remember that name, Rob Brooks, they didn't make it. It killed them, literally. They couldn't handle it. They were totally demoralized. I had burnout. It was diagnosed by 3 doctors, 3 specialists. They put me on 50% working because of burnout. And in each of the medical findings, it said burnout due to mobbing at the place of work. The guy I'm talking about lost 80%, 80, friends, not 18, 80% of his staff in the first year. And it left me in a really bad shape. So they offered me early retirement. I could have stayed at Swiss Info, but they said to me, "We don't think you want that." I said, "I don't." Certainly not. Okay. And we'll give you an early retirement package. And I took it. That's 20 years ago, exactly 20 years ago. This is 2022. I retired early at the age of 56. Sounds great. And I really enjoyed it, I must say. But I was looking for something else to keep me busy. SRI was no more. SRI went off the air. Nobody was doing English language radio in the classic style from Switzerland. So I decided I would start a website. I couldn't open up a shortwave station, but I could get on the internet. And I started SwitZerlandInSound.com. It's a kind of a way of continuing the tradition of reporting on Switzerland in a colorful way, the same way I used to do it on SRI. I must say I haven't produced very much lately. There are technical reasons for that, but there's an awful lot there. It's a library which continues to grow, and I have some very, very old stuff on there, surviving features I did, and very importantly and interestingly, the 2 Bobs live on at SwitZerlandInSound.com. We have the only surviving old shows, even the early ones before I was involved. And then Bob and I got together, Bob Thomann and I got together, and we produced even new programming for the website. So if you missed the 2 Bobs, go to SwitZerlandInSound.com and look under the 2 Bobs. I think you'll find it very, very interesting and entertaining. As far as the internet is concerned, well, the folly of the internet has been proved. Great technology. We're using it right now to do this presentation. Nothing against that. But in terms of getting a message through to a crisis area, the only way to do it is shortwave. Nobody does it better. If they don't like you on the internet, they just pull the plug on you. Literally, you're gone. They've done it in China. They've done it in Iran. They've done it in Russia, the Middle East, Asia, Africa. You're gone. So what's left? Nothing, unless you have a few shortwave programs that are still available. And this was the folly of putting all of the international broadcasting eggs into the internet basket. Great technology when it works, but at the moment it's not working. There are special shortwave broadcasts to Russia and Ukraine. The BBC, Vatican Radio, Romania, Spain, and Austria have stepped up their communications to HF communications to those countries. But the question is it getting through? I've talked to various people about it. The skeptics say there are no shortwave radios left, and not even there. I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think the old-timers who still remember the Cold War, and I guess I have to consider myself an old-timer at the age of 77 as we speak, I think the radios are still around. There are radio amateurs in Eastern Europe who pick this up. They listen to international broadcasts, and they do spread the word. I don't know. Is Tom Weatherspoon online? Tom, are you around?
No, I don't see him, Bob.
And we're coming to the end here. I do want to talk about the state of amateur radio in Europe and Switzerland. We have 5,000 hams here in HB9, by the way, for a country of 8 million people. It's a healthy hobby. People are doing it here. As far as the rest of Europe is concerned, it's a mixed bag. There are pros and cons about it. What they've done basically is to lower the threshold to getting a ham license over here. I mean, when you and I got our ham licenses, I know I had to do a ham radio examination in New York at the FCC field office. You didn't go to a ham to do it. I had to pass a 13-word per minute code test and a 50-question examination. But right now, in many parts of Europe, especially in Southern Europe and also in the UK, they have eliminated code, also in the U.S., we know that. That's controversial among many hams. It used to be considered a barrier to getting a ham license. You had to really be dedicated to get a ham license by getting through a code test, but they've eliminated that. In the UK, basically in some other countries, Italy, for example, as I understand it, you can basically get a ham license by filling out a coupon in the cornflakes box. Sign your name, and you too can be a radio ham. And what we have here, especially on 40 meters has become the new citizens band of Europe. The procedures are terrible. They are incredibly bad. QRM, bad procedures, ill-mannered, rude people, who don't understand the technology. They go out and they buy a radio, they plug it in, and they think they're still on citizens band. That's my view of what's going on in Europe. It is healthy. We got lots of stations on the air over here. But I'll be very frank with you. I look forward to pointing the antenna at 300 degrees to Eastern North America and hearing the traditional good operating procedures of American and Canadian stations and a good old-fashioned rag chew. Over here, all you hear is 59 QRZ, 59 QRZ, and every weekend, practically, we are inundated, we are mobbed by contests, senseless contests that prove absolutely nothing. I remember the old days of contests. At least you exchange a name, a location, your equipment, your power. You got something out of it. But now all you hear is 59. Everybody's 59. The logs come pre-filled with 59. So what's the point? And it really, I feel sorry for guys who work during the week. They come home, they want to do some hamming, and they're swamped by contesters. That's a real problem with me. Anyway, that's about it from this end. As they say in French, le micro est à toi.
Bob, thanks very much. This is great.